There's a new Star Wars movie out, in case you didn't know. And some of you may have already ventured to see it, or some may be seeing this afternoon, but one of the things we know from the Star Wars franchise is the epic phrase, "May the Force," and as good Lutherans we'd say, "and also with you." But today, let's just think about powerful forces. Forces like addiction, self-interest, evil, the denial of truth. That is a very, very powerful force. There's gravity, this thing that keeps us from floating into space. That's really an amazing force. Albert Einstein, the great physicist, is said to have proclaimed that compound interest is the most powerful force in the universe. But on this fourth Sunday of Advent, just 2 days before Christmas, we encounter a story, I think, a force that's far more powerful that we see in the story of Joseph. So Joseph was he was called a tectone, a person who worked with stone, wood, or other building materials. Tectones weren't necessarily custom cabinet makers. There's the sense that they were day laborers who did a lot of grunt work. They weren't high on the social scale whatsoever. But we do know that any tectone would have obviously learned to use a variety of tools. It's probably very, very obvious, but in the first century and for much of human history, you simply trained your child to do what you did. Sons did what their fathers did. So the father, in a sense, automatically was the mentor, would spend time with his child, would talk with them, would, as they're teaching a trade, would correct their mistakes. I'm sure many life lessons were taught along the way. I'm sure the child would have had many, many questions. But the child was to become your spitting image. And all signs in the Gospel say that Jesus became a tectone. He's referred to that way at various points. And so that naturally means Joseph would have been his mentor. And Joseph, he grew up in this town called Nazareth, which was really, just so you know, is made up of about 90 to 120 people or so. It was a tiny, tiny village, not a booming place for business. But let me just show you a photo. About 4 miles from Nazareth, all through Jesus' childhood, was this massive development project which would have called for lots and lots and lots of tectones. This new capital was being built. The new capital of Galilee was being built all throughout Jesus' childhood, called Sepphoris. It meant buildings were going up, new dwellings were being built. You can see the huge amphitheater there was going up, being constructed. There was a continual need for door openings, windows, tile, installations of all sorts of things. And the growing consensus of biblical scholars is that Joseph almost certainly took Jesus to work in Sepphoris each day, 4 miles each way, to help build, to make a living. And tradition has it that Mary grew up here. Mary grew up in Sepphoris. The home of her parents, Anna and Joachim, were supposedly in that capital city. It's kind of fun. It's kind of fun when you're there to think about Joseph walking with Jesus each day, 4 miles each way, conversing along the way. It's kind of fun to think of them working together in some capacity, even if we don't know what that necessarily looked like. But I'm sure they naturally would have used tools. It's easy to imagine Joseph the tectone working with tools like what you see on the screen there, mallet and chisel. And he would have taught Jesus to use a mallet and chisel as well. But on the shelf, these tools don't do much. They're kind of like the tools in my house. They don't do much. But in the hands of a tectone, they are tools with tremendous potential. If you just think about it very, very simplistically, a mallet is a tool to exert force. A chisel, though, is a tool to shape, to finesse, to adapt things to new circumstances. But the two of them kind of work together. They need each other. And in the hands of a skilled craftsman, they make things work. They can fix a problem. They can create something new that works. If you take a look at that, just know that mallets and chisels are the tools of an artist. But what you see in the picture there is a huge, enormous block of marble. Okay, it could be sharper, but that's what I see. I think if you looked at that on your computer screen, you'd see that as well. Huge block of marble. But this is the Renaissance sculptor Michelangelo was just a genius with a mallet and chisel. And this is what he said. He said, every block of stone has a statue inside of it, and it is the task of the sculptor to discover it. He went even further. He said, the sculpture is actually already complete within the marble block before I start my work. It's already there, he said. I just have to chisel away the superfluous material. Others look at that and they just say, big block, I see big block. Michelangelo saw a work of beauty just waiting to be revealed, waiting to be uncovered. Story in the gospel today is a big block of a mess, is what I want to say. There's little to be seen on the surface. It's all kind of hidden and obscured at the start. But somehow, Joseph the Tectone, let's just say with some divine inspiration, will bring beauty to the surface. And as hard for it to be, we're 21st century people, our worldview is different. I'm just going to ask you for just a moment to suspend your 21st century thinking and just put yourself in the first century. 20 centuries ago, it was an absolute patriarchal dominated world. First century marriage customs were not necessarily based on love. They were very, very contract oriented. Women were considered property. Most marriages were arranged. And it was a multi-step process. Okay, there would be what we call a betrothal ceremony in the bride's family home. And at that ceremony, there would be the signing of a document, signing of an agreement. And the groom would actually open his wallet and pay a substantial amount of money to the bride's family. It's called the bride price. And the couple would be officially married at that point. They'd be officially connected to each other. But at that point, they were not allowed to sleep together, live together, be intimate in any way. She'd keep living in her home. He'd keep living in his home for perhaps a year, maybe even 2 years, until this formal marriage ceremony occurred. And when the formal marriage ceremony occurred, it was this official transfer of her from this home to her new home. Okay, it makes sense to me. During this intermittent period, though, the intermittent period of 1 to 2 years while she remained there, the groom was able to visit. He was able to visit. And so what you need to see today is during the intermittent time when Joseph visited Mary, she reveals, I'm pregnant. And that's kind of a problem because Joseph knows he's not the father. And on the surface, it must have looked to him like an absolute betrayal. It had all the looks of infidelity. And what you need to see is I think Joseph had some real options. He certainly could yield the hammer and yield his power. Think of what he could do. He could easily gather 2 witnesses and just simply publicly declare that Mary had been unfaithful, announce he's divorcing her, brand her as an adulteress. Her family would be shamed, and they would have to return that sum of money, the bride price, to him. But she'd have a scarlet letter attached to her forever. The child that she bore would have a stigma attached to them as well. But Deuteronomy 22, the Old Testament, goes way further than that. Way further than that. Deuteronomy 22 says an act of infidelity was punishable by death, by stoning. The elders of the town could take her, put her right at the door of her father's house, and stone her to death, and the bride price would be returned. It's a tough, tough thing. One block of a mess. And I'm sure that Joseph was angry. I'm sure that he was hurting. But Matthew 1 says Joseph wasn't going to pursue those options. He wasn't going to pursue those options that I've mentioned. He wasn't going to hammer away. Rather, what I want you to see is sort of him getting out the chisel and being a bit creative and starting to carve a new story, which is the force of grace and mercy. And, it seems that when I read that text, it seems to me that what he was going to do was quietly say to two witnesses, I'm divorcing Mary, which he was entitled to do, but it doesn't seem like he was actually going to give a reason. He was just saying, I'm divorcing her, no cause, I'm just out of here. He was preparing to walk away. He's going to let her family keep the bride price, let people just assume that baby was his. He was just going to walk away. He was, in a sense, saying, I'm willing to take the heat. I'm willing to have people blame me. And hear me when I say this. I think he's sort of showing his character because he's saying, I do not want this young lady to be harmed in any way. I'm willing to suffer myself, and I'm willing to let people think I'm a jerk. You and I know more to the story, so we sort of have this omniscience to us. We know that God is involved. And what we see is that God speaks into his life. But what you need to see about Joseph is he is a spiritually open person, which is something we all should try to be, spiritually open. And as a result, he's open to hearing God's voice speak into his life. He shows himself in the story willing to listen, willing to trust that God actually will lead him in the days to come, even if what's in front of him seems scary and confusing. He shows himself willing to change his mind, willing to give the marriage a chance, willing to engage Mary in a new way. And that's exactly what it did. And it says he adopts Jesus as his own child and names him. And you know what I said at the beginning is certainly became his mentor. But Joseph's willingness to not hammer away, but rather do something different, is what I would say is a first century act of great beauty. It's the force of grace, mercy, and love in action. And it's that action that spared Jesus' life before it began. Ultimately, she could have been put to death, which meant Jesus wouldn't have arrived on this planet. But this act of mercy brought Jesus into the world. It's that force of grace and mercy that Jesus grew up and demonstrated over and over and over again in the course of his daily life. He cast out demons, engaged people that would be left outside of any care by a lot of people. He went to those people. He healed the sick. He challenged those in authority. He welcomed sinners and said, you are my friend. You know, in confirmation, my pastor defined mercy as an act of showing undeserved love. And he said that's something God gives to us. It's something we experience as a gift. And it's something you and I are called to share in the world. Mercy and undeserved love. Mercy, when we extend that to other people, you realize it builds new momentum. It changes lives. It tears down walls. It has an incredibly lasting impact. You know, our world is loaded with too many people. Too many people who simply hammer away. They hammer away all the time. They want to yield their power over others. They continually belittle other people. And what I'd say is that's a shame, because they're missing out on the incredible beauty that is just simply waiting to be revealed, and they need someone to witness to it so they can join that cause. The world needs artists like you and I, who day in and day out choose to chisel away. We chisel away when we stand up for others, when we speak words of kindness, when we show other people the things that make for peace, and we strive only every day to encourage and bring out the best in others. The world needs you and I to chisel away day in and day out with that kind of witness. Amen.